So today we're going to talk about why sometimes our communication goes awry in families. And it's a concept called triangles. And what happens is in a relationship with two people, sometimes it's really hard to be direct, not because we don't love them, in fact, because we do love them. So we tend to think of it like a stool where we bring a third person or a third perspective into this. And it's something we learn very early on. Everyone does it, and it happens most with family companies because of the fact that we want to respect each other, care about each other, and make sure we're not hurting each other. Unfortunately, as we'll hear today from this group, the opposite often happens. So, Jonathan, why don't you talk about triangulation for us today?
Thank you. So let's begin with there are two people who have something between them that they need to communicate about. And for any number of reasons, often around the idea of it's really stressful for them to do that, they look for support. So they bring in somebody else to that conversation. And it's not that that can't be a positive, but oftentimes bringing another person in imbalances the conversation. What your goal needs to be is what's the problem that we need to work on? And if the other person, we bring them in and we're bringing them in to support how we think it should be worked on, we're preventing forward movement. So the triangle, which as in the three-legged stool might be more stable, seeming construction-wise, is actually weakening because you aren't addressing the thing that is between the two people. Basically, and there are different models that we'll get to about what those triangles look like and how they function and what the roles are that we're taking. And that's where we're going to go to today.
So, Jonathan, let me check my understanding. It sounds like if you and I are siblings and we're having a disagreement, and Donnel is our brother, and I go tell him about this, he has a couple responses. He can say, go talk to Jonathan about this, and here's my perspective.
And that would be great.
Doesn't often happen, even though it would be great. Likely, Donnel says, Natalie, you're wrong because he doesn't like me. Or he actually says, I also don't like Jonathan. Isn't he a jerk? And then he goes and tells our two other siblings. And they tell our mom and our dad. And now the thing that you and I need to talk about, I feel justified in.
Yes.
And the rest of our family's mad.
And what we've done is we've made the problem worse by a lot of dust-ups that are about relationships, delicious as they are and important as they are, but they're not what we really need to be dealing with.
Absolutely. Got it. That's why in families, everybody knows what just happened, even if they weren't in the room. Donnel, I think you have a really great client case about that.
Yeah, I've seen this more than once, as I think we all have. But one that comes to mind most particular was a family that was looking at passing on ownership to two of the siblings out of a group of five. And it was a brother and sister. And in this situation, there was a lot of mistrust between the brother and sister, and a lot of feelings of needing to make things fair and equitable by the father. And so when these two would get into any sort of argument in operations of the business, instead of having direct conversation with each other to resolve it, what they would often do is have side conversations with their dad. And by bringing the dad in, instead of him directing them back to have the conversation with each other, the dad would then often go outside and start talking to the mom. Mm-hmm. And each of the two siblings would go outside and talk to their spouses. And it would end up then spreading out to the other siblings. And instead of creating a situation where the two were addressing an issue directly and working constructively to solve it, it would turn into huge family blowouts that would often require intervention from, me as an advisor or other trusted people in their family.
Wonderful. Well, not really.
But a good example.
A very good example. And as you said, it's not the only client that does this. Now we're going to throw you a curveball where we're actually going to talk about a triangle that doesn't involve three people. It's two of us. So we'll continue that we're all siblings in this room. And Jonathan missed a deadline. I'm picking on Jonathan, I know, but he can take it.
I can take it, yeah.
So Jonathan missed a deadline I had asked him about pretty regularly. And instead of calling Donnel, what I do is I yell at Jonathan, or I'm curt with him. Some of you will say, I've never yelled at anyone. And I say, why did you do that? And there's a lot of finger wagging that comes up. And so I'm being what we call a persecutor, right? And so I'm not being terribly nice.
And I'm being a victim
By doing what? What would you say to me?
by saying, you're horrible and you're making me feel bad, but still, I'm not addressing the problem. I'm addressing how I feel about you.
Absolutely. And now, even though as a persecutor or what someone might call a bully, I'm actually going to respond by being a rescuer, where I feel bad that I made him feel bad. And I'm going to say, oh, that's okay, Jonathan. Like, maybe you're right. I'm mean. And maybe I didn't clarify things. And what happens throughout the lifetime of us working together is we repeat this cycle over and over again. So you have these three roles: persecutor, rescuer, and victim. Sometimes they happen all at once, just between two people. It can also happen in the previous example if we had brought Donnel in and changed it. So what we want to do instead of being a persecutor is be a coach. When he's missed a deadline, I want to sit there and say, what went wrong? How can I support you? And instead of being a victim, he can be a creator. What would that look like for you?
Well, it would look like us actually having a real conversation about what went into the experience of each other and of the work that we're finding problematic. So if we're talking and yelling at each other, that never gets addressed, which means it's like Groundhog Day over and over and over again. Problem never gets resolved, probably gets worse, and our relationships never get better, they get worse.
Absolutely. And so instead of being a rescuer, we can be a challenger that really says, what's the thing that we need to do to move this forward? So in a sense, it's pushing accountability still, even if it's challenging, so that we can actually deepen the relationship.
Yeah, and there's an example that really comes to mind with this one, again, through client work. And this happens in every family. It happens in our families in different ways over the years. So it's
Sure.
not anything that's abnormal. It's just that when there's significant amounts of anxiety and a lot at stake, it can be consequential. And in the example that I'm thinking of, I had two sisters who were siblings and were running an organization, and it was being passed down to them. And one of them was highly competent and in the president position, and the other one was sort of floating around different positions within the operations. And whenever the sister who was the president was trying to hold her other sister accountable for missing deadlines or not completing work with high standards, what would end up happening is she would be so angry about it that it would be perceived as an attack. She would end up creating a situation where then the story becomes, instead of accountability and follow through, the sister is making the story about being victimized by her mean sister, which can bring in all sorts of other issues. And the point is missed about the original issue. And one of the other things that can happen when this dynamic is being played out by family members is it can trickle down. And all of a sudden, this same behavior, you could see it in leadership team meetings between the sister who was the president and some of her other leadership team. And once, speaking in terms of like interventions, once this pattern became something that they were aware of and started to understand some of the ways to get out of it, it started to shift. And instead of the correction by the sister president becoming about victimhood, it became about accountability and job performance. And they actually started making a little bit of headway with it.
That's wonderful. That brings us to the steps of how do we recognize and stop these triangles, Jonathan?
Well, I think one of the strongest cues that you're in a triangle is unsuccessful progress. So, assess. Here's a problem. It was on the table, or we've had meetings about it. We've done this over and over again. If I've told you 1,000 times, I've told you, all of those are cues that you're in a triangle that you're not being successful with. So, that could be a hard thing to get out on our own. And we might do well to carefully select some support or guidance from an outside person, someone who is not in the triangle, who can converse with us about what's going on and help us pull apart from, one thing, what is the problem that needs to get solved? Let's say, in the business, what's the business problem? And then what is the family relationship problem that's getting in the way of that? Pull those apart. And we would then want to focus on probably one of those. They're very different sets of work. Say the business problem. And your coach, your guide, your person you went to, how do I go do the thing that's so scary for me and stay with it and not get deflected from the problem, the business problem, while I'm feeling all those emotional things?
Absolutely. So what I hear you saying is first recognize that you're there.
Oh,
And a
yeah.
good indicator is that when we're stuck, when we keep doing the thing, you think it's Groundhog's Day, it's a triangle. Then we want to make sure who we talk to, instead of inviting them into the conflict, is someone that can help us be accountable to fixing the conflict between the person, thinking about the way that we're looking at the problem differently. And if your family knows about triangles, first have them watch this video. If they don't,
Yeah.
you can actually say, I think this is a triangle. What are we going to do about it? Donnel, any other thoughts that would be helpful for stepping out of these triangles?
I think it starts with self-awareness and being able
Yeah.
to identify the dynamic that's happening.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone. We'll look forward to seeing you in our next video.